Why should global governance trends matter to U.S. boards? Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. On this show, we share perspectives from leading corporate directors and discuss what makes boards effective, how they can help companies face challenges today, and become future-ready. In this episode, Friso van der Oord, NACD Senior Vice President of Content, Mary McDowell, a board member in the United States and the United Kingdom, and Rich Fields, head of the Russell Reynolds Board Effectiveness Practice, discuss the themes dominating boardrooms around the world and how U.S. governance compares to governance in other countries, with a close look at the United Kingdom. Have you heard about the benefits of NACD's certification program? Today's boards operate in a dynamic and rapidly evolving world. The National Association of Corporate Directors provides directorship certification that sets the standard for high-impact board directors. It's more than certification. This is the premier program, preparing directors to successfully navigate an increasingly complex business and governance landscape. NACD's directorship certification will enable you to demonstrate commitment, deliver confidently, and create real value for your organization. Learn more and apply today at nacdonline.org. And now, your host.
Welcome, Rich and Mary, to the NACD BoardVision podcast. My name is Friso van der Oord, the head of content at the organization, and I look forward to a great dialogue over the next little while about how boardrooms are evolving globally in this period of deglobalization, increased protectionism, and just a blistering speed of change. We have quite a few international listeners tuned in, so we're taking a short global tour and discuss similarities as well as differences across various countries in how boards do their work. So let's jump right in with Rich, our expert from Russell Reynolds, and Mary, who represents many different boards in both the US and the UK. They'll share stories, examples, some data. Mary in particular will go a little deeper on what it means to serve on a board overseas and how to consider accepting those types of positions. But Rich, let me start with you. So tell us a little bit more about the work Russell Reynolds has done on global governance. You've come out with a report for a couple of years now. How did that come about?
Yeah, we, for the last 9 years, coming up on our 10th, have done an annual survey of key trends in corporate governance across the globe. Russell Reynolds is a global leadership advisory firm. We operate in a number of different markets, and both for our clients in particular markets want to know what's going on where they are, and many clients want to understand what might be coming from elsewhere. There are kind of migratory patterns for corporate governance expectations. In the US, for example, we often will start to do things that were done in Europe a few years after they do. And given all of those questions and the need to be smart on these issues, whether it's helping a company with a board evaluation or finding their next director or CEO, understanding what external stakeholders are looking for is critically important to providing well-rounded advice. And so each year, we have interviewed leaders in the corporate governance ecosystem to understand what happened this past year, what's coming, what to expect, what to watch out for. Each year, the report gets a little bit longer, covers a few more jurisdictions. That'll happen again here for the 10th year, just because there's so much going on and so many people are interested in better understanding the corporate governance ecosystem around them, how it'll evolve, and how it'll affect their companies.
No, fascinating. I've looked at your report for the last few years and recommend anybody on the podcast to read them. Very, very helpful perspectives on how governance is evolving in different countries, Canada, Brazil, Spain, Italy. You cover a lot of different geographies. What are some of the big differences you've seen emerge over the last few years in perhaps board operations, board structure across the markets you looked at?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's not a tale of two cities. It's a tale of 30 different stories, I think, because different markets are at very different places with corporate governance. Some are just emerging, others are very mature. The US obviously is an unusual decentralized governance system with a lot of different players. Many other jurisdictions have clearer codes of conduct, some that are more rigorous and others that are less so. And so it's hard to talk about trends across the globe without needing to identify a number of different places where things are different. But in the past year, there were a few themes that emerged in different ways across most of the jurisdictions that we covered. The four big themes: one, disruptive innovation, particularly AI, becoming a much bigger conversation topic in boardrooms. Two, diversity, maintaining its mind share and time share in the boardroom, although manifesting in very different ways, as we might come back to. Countries, there's some very diverse boards, and others that are other markets where it's really starting to catch up. ESG, which I hate the phrase. We could spend the whole hour talking about how it's a mishmash, but it is what it is. There's a lot of continued interest in the non-financial drivers of financial performance, and it manifests in very different ways. I think that the general theme for the past year has been across the globe, expect continued attention, but in many markets, including the US, a whole lot less talk as the term has become politicized and weaponized. And then lastly, kind of an interesting trend for public companies is that their standards are starting to migrate more to private enterprises. So larger, more sophisticated private businesses, whether family-owned, private capital-owned, are more readily adopting kind of the best of public governance standards. So we're seeing a little bit of a convergence, regardless of what type of company we're looking at.
Now, fascinating, Richard. Indeed, we'll come back to some of those big themes with you and Mary in a bit. I did have a question about the U.S. market. You mentioned it's decentralized. It does not have a code. How different is it from most of our jurisdictions? Do you see the comply and explain model, the code model, being kind of the prevalent model globally?
It's always hard to kind of put numbers on these things because, or are we counting the number of businesses, the dollars of market capitalization, the revenue, the number of employees, and not all of the information is terribly public. But I think the U.S. has a distinctively confusing matrix. I don't know what the right word to use is, model, that I know that our colleagues from abroad sometimes have a little bit of a harder time kind of getting their arms around. You can't just go to the one source of truth. There's a lot of different places that you need to look. And as we increasingly see, and I think part of the reason that this report exists is even once you have understood what the baseline legal and regulatory standards are for your company, in your industry, with your regulators, in your state of incorporation, that's a floor, not a ceiling. Most of the time, boards should be more interested in what your stakeholders, particularly your largest investors, are looking for. Good example, an easy one to kind of get your arms around, is with diversity, right? I mean, there's not a lot of, for U.S. companies, requirements to be diverse. The biggest baseline requirement is a disclosure requirement for NASDAQ-listed companies. But your investors don't care whether you're NASDAQ or NYSE listed. All right, they're starting to set clearer standards, particularly based on company size and index, for what a minimum acceptable level of diversity is. And so from abroad, there's just so many different sources that you have to take stock of, where in many other jurisdictions with a clearer code, a little bit more consistency among the institutional investors, there's still variation. There's still different preferences and different practices. But that bullseye is tighter, I think, than it ever will be in the U.S. I don't know, Mary. You see it from both sides. How do you characterize the differences between here in the UK, for example?
Right. Well, Friso used the phrase comply or explain, which is definitely the model that is used in the UK, which is the international jurisdiction where I have the most experience. And there are clear differences there in terms of things that must be complied with. Probably the biggest one in the UK and other European jurisdictions is just the limited window in which a director is deemed to be independent. And so after 9 years of serving as an independent director, if you were to continue to serve on the board, you would no longer be deemed independent. So that provokes a refresh cycle at the end of a 9-year board tenure, which does make sure there's a continual flow of new ideas and new thoughts coming into the boardroom. The diversity requirements are also specified. So a need for at least 40% women on the board, and a relatively new requirement to have at least one ethnic minority, as well as a need to have one senior position such as CEO, CFO, chair, senior independent director held by a woman. So those are all things that are disclosed in the annual report and heavily monitored by the regulatory agencies as well as the proxy services. Another thing that is relatively new, I think it came out around 2019, was the need to have a designee on the board who is the interface and champion for colleague engagement. And so some other European countries have designated employee representation on a board. The UK did not go that far, but there is one of the non-executive directors that has the responsibility to drive colleague engagement and ensure the voice of the employees is heard in the boardroom.
Fascinating, Mary. There are some significant differences, and it looks like in some of those markets, governance is a little bit more prescriptive, while in the US, boards tend to have some more autonomy in how they compose themselves, how they, in some ways, compensate themselves, how they operate. One element in the US, and I'd love to get both of your perspectives on it, is this whole concept of noses in, fingers out. Right? We as a boardroom at times may need to encroach on management territory when the crises are up, but there's a clear line that cannot be stepped over between the role of the board and the role of management. In other jurisdictions, you have this often two-tiered structure, right? The supervisory board and the management board. How different is this noses in, fingers out model elsewhere, or at the end of the day, it isn't all that different?
Right. So in terms of the supervisory board, that very much adheres to the noses in, fingers out model, and it's the management board that is driving the operational day-to-day performance of the company and is accountable for the results. So the supervisory board or the corporate board in other jurisdictions, hiring, firing, management of the CEO and senior executive teams, compensation, oversight of large M&A, engagement and strategy, sort of the typical activities of a board.
Maybe the only thing I would lightly push back on, Friso, is that line I don't think is terribly clear in the U.S. We've done more than 500 board effectiveness projects, and the nature of that line is a feature of most of those board evaluations, because there's some things that are clearly in, right? The decisions to compensate, to hire, retain, fire the CEO, clearly board responsibilities. Day-to-day operational issues, clearly management responsibilities, and then a whole lot of stuff in the middle that is not always self-evident exactly where it falls, right? I mean, the big picture, a board helping to oversee strategy. Well, strategy is going to be the result of a lot of those day-to-day decisions. When and how does a board dig in to where the rubber is meeting the road as a means of testing the strategy, for example. And sometimes it takes, going back to basics to kind of reaffirm, hey, here's what we're doing. Here's what our responsibilities are. Here is when and why, we might need to dive into some subjects that are not obviously in or out. Here's a better understanding of how that makes the management team feel when we do so, and kind of level set and make sure that there is clarity on those messy subjects in the middle. So noses in, fingers out. There's a lot of common phrases that I think are more true than not. But when you get into a particular boardroom, I don't think it's always clear to everyone there exactly where those lines are all the time.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I would say it's also highly situational. If things are going well with the company, there's an experienced CEO, you're as a board, you're sort of operating at the margins because you're pleased with the results and how the results are being delivered. A new CEO, a company in crisis, a company in a sector that is going through a lot of transformation, there's going to be heavier engagement from the board, and you're really heavily reliant on the skills of the chair to affect board cohesion, board engagement, and getting that right balance with the CEO so that you can navigate some uncertainty that doesn't exist when a company is, on a rocket ship ride.
Yeah, great point, Mary. And I think it's been even more fluid over the last few years, obviously with the pandemic crisis, where boards had to work more closely with management on items that may have felt operational, like employee health, business continuity, and then more recently with, Rich, you mentioned it, artificial intelligence, right? What does that mean for our strategy, our business model, our talent, and everything else, where boards are stepping in, certainly to guide the strategy, but to at times also offer their stark opinions on what needs to happen operationally. We've seen that quite a bit in our engagements with NACD members. So let's go back to the topic at hand on the international arena. And Richard, you touched on it a little bit already around board composition. What are some of the findings from the work around differences in board size, director tenure? Is the US an outlier here, or do we see similarities perhaps across different markets?
Yeah, Mary already hinted at one of the big topics, and maybe the single topic that I spend most of my time thinking about, with how to ensure a board has the right mix of backgrounds, skills, and experiences to be, a strategic asset that the management team leverages rather than an obstacle that it tries to overcome. And that's easier said than done. In the US, we do not have the same type of comply or explain or other rules that affect the designation of independence or really force much turnover. In the US, there's been a trend to see fewer retirement age policies, and those companies that do have them have on average increased the age at which they apply. And even if you have those in place, there are many cases of exceptions, often very legitimate, important exceptions that boards make, which ultimately render those rules somewhat toothless. Talking about bringing new directors with beneficial skills onto the board, not a terribly difficult conversation, but very easy to see the value and the opportunity. Talking about how you're going to make space for those directors, not something that most boards are volunteering to do quite as eagerly as you might hope. So in the US in particular, a lot of time is spent helping think through thoughtful, objective, rigorous, compassionate ways to determine what a board thinks its right size should be, what its size is currently, what background skills or experiences gaps it might see, or opportunities to expand skills that are on the board, and what that's going to mean for board composition, including director retirements. That's a very sensitive decision, sensitive set of discussions here, where in some other markets, as a benefit of the policies, it's kind of more normal course. And even if it's not just driven by the kind of numerical thresholds, the conversation is less taboo, I think, than it is in some boardrooms here. Now, the downside, obviously, is in those markets, you're going to have people leaving boards that are still contributing a heck of a lot of value. I've worked with many directors at U.S. companies that are older than 75, that have been on boards for more than 15 years, that when you poll the board, everyone says, listen, that's our most valuable player. Right? That's a person that's really contributing a ton of value. I would hate to see that person leave. So in the US, you're able to have some more thoughtful discussions with fewer penalties, even in kind of the comply or explain style penalties of having someone persist. But you do end up having a lot of boards that maybe wait a little bit too long to make the necessary changes to really upskill the board for the business of today and tomorrow, and not just the business of yesterday. A particular sub-element on that composition point is diversity, where the U.S. is somewhere toward the middle, maybe the upper end of the middle. Many markets in Europe with substantially more average diversity across different dimensions than the U.S., but a lot of boards that are very, I'm trying to think of a polite way to say behind, and I'm failing to come up with the right word, but a lot of boards where diversity has not been a discussion topic in the past, where it's just starting to become a little bit of a topic. And it's going to go through that same cycle that that the U.S. and other markets went through to kind of get past that historical presumption that boards are just supposed to be mostly white and mostly male. That's not true. It's proven not true in many markets, but some are taking a little bit more time to catch up.
Mary, as you look at the market in the UK, is offboarding less of a stigma there? Is refreshment indeed more dynamic? You can have those candid conversations about turnover, about succession planning?
Yeah, it's expected. So everybody knows the maximum that you can be on a board and be deemed independent is 9 years. So it's a built-in refreshment cycle without sort of the discomfort of the awkward conversations that Rich just described. So it's just a natural part of life. And as Rich said, very often you're seeing very valued and esteemed colleagues leave, but those are the rules and people comply.
Fascinating. Is overboarding in the UK an issue where you mentioned there are excellent directors, right, who could fulfill roles in multiple companies? Are they taking numerous positions, or is that more of a US phenomenon?
Well, I think as in the U.S., where you see the proxy agencies sort of monitoring that situation, you have the same kind of controls in place in the U.K. and I'm sure other places of sort of monitoring and getting no votes if an individual is deemed to be overboarded.
It's funny, though, the different kind of market standards for what overboarding is. In the U.S., you can look at a number of different tables that are published by us, by law firms, et cetera, that identify, for this investor, here's the number of boards that is permitted. Here's what differs if you're a CEO or an NEO. There's kind of a couple of different common tiers at 3 or 4, but some variation. But it's based on just the number of public company boards, with just a couple of investors that have kickers for non-executive chairs or lead directors. In most of Europe, it's more of a formula where certain types of board seats count as a certain number of points, and you can't go over that number of points to avoid being overboarded. And it can be interesting to work with folks like Mary, who are sitting in boards in multiple jurisdictions, to figure out, okay, well, here's what the calculation is going to be for these boards in the US. Here's what it's going to be like for those. And you might need to think about whether you want to take on an independent board leadership role because it's going to push you over the threshold with these investors, and it's going to mean this amount of blowback at the annual meetings. And it's become interesting to see the different kind of standards that are out there. There's been a lot of talk in the US about, will we see kind of more variables included in this calculation? If you're an audit chair at a company going through a restatement, that's a board seat that's going to feel like 2, 3, 4 boards. Right? That's a hefty load, but not really picked up by most overboarding standards. The context or some of those committee chairmanships that might be very busy. So it's a very imperfect tool. We've seen some investors pull back and say, well, we have this kind of guideline, but we're willing to make exceptions. It'll be really interesting, I think, over the next couple of years to see whether those are outliers and we return to kind of harder and faster limits. And if those harder and faster limits start to include, other variables that we all know would affect the ability of someone to have sufficient time to really be a thoughtful member at each of the boards on which they serve.
Rich, to that point, do you see a big difference in the appointment of sitting executives on boards? Right, in the US, you see quite a few sitting CEOs also have board seats elsewhere. And there's a limit to that. Is that a practice employed elsewhere in different markets?
I think that the single most common specification we work on with clients for a board seat is a sitting or very recently retired CEO. That's pretty consistent. I think that, the common standard is, each of those folks should be able to sit on one additional outside board beyond the board of their kind of home company, assuming that they sit on that board, which just creates kind of a numerical limitation, right? There's only so many available sitting CEO slots for any given board, which puts those folks in higher demand. There's going to be continued interest in people who have lived in that role at or very, very close to the top of the house now or recently, because it helps bring some depth and recency of perspective to boardroom conversations. But it's always going to be a hard get for boards. I think that what we've seen recently to kind of, if you can't get that, you're trying to find very senior executives in adjacent industries that will not cause any conflicts or perceptions of conflicts, but can really offer some additional heft on industry-specific issues. I think that those are going to be common demands in the U.S. and abroad, from now until as far as I can predict in the future.
Mary, let's go back to the topic I think both you and Rich brought up earlier, the diversity in the boardroom, perhaps more prescriptive in the UK than in the US. And gender diversity is a big topic in this year's report. Talk a little bit about how your UK board is approaching gender diversity in terms of its recruitment, succession planning, any major differences between your UK board and US board there?
So given that there is a 40% requirement in the UK, we strive to meet and maintain that in our recruiting efforts and balance on the board. But I would say the overriding ethos is that of a diversity of perspectives and experience. So, earlier in the conversation, we talked about age. In just the most recent past few years, it would have been really helpful to have somebody who had experienced inflation in their career, which many more recent executives had not. So somebody, a little longer in their career tenure, it's very valuable to have that experience. Similarly, you want people on the board that lived through the pandemic as an operating executive and sort of understand the employee challenges, the geopolitical turmoil, and what that has brought to the workforce. So it's achieving that balance overall in perspectives, experience, as well as gender, ethnic diversity, other factors that make the rich mix of the board. And so you're always kind of balancing that. Even this most recent thread about hiring sitting CEOs, super valuable to have that experience on the board. But if you have a board that is all sitting CEOs, nobody's got bandwidth for special committees or when some sort of crisis requiring a huge amount of time comes up. So again, you want that blend of people with recent relevant experience as well as people with active day jobs to create the richest discussions and hopefully the most productive and helpful guidance for the management team.
In the US, we see a backlash on diversity at many different levels, right? The recent Supreme Court ruling, we've seen activists challenge companies, not so much on board diversity, but D&I programs. Mary, is that very different in the UK? This is a widely accepted progressive trend moving forward, or is there also debate within the UK at the societal level around this?
I would not purport to be an expert on the UK. I think the conversation is very intense in the US, and as Rich had said, has really gotten kind of tangled up in sort of political divides and other elements and factors going on that are more intense in the US. I think it's healthy to say what are the non-financial elements that contribute to business performance and take a sharp eye to make sure that you are focused on the things that is going to drive business success and not metrics for the sake of metrics. So, debate is good. Some of the intensity and severe backlash than we see in the US, that can be a distraction.
Yeah, Rich, to follow up on that, when we talked in a prep call, you mentioned the difference in substance and language around the concept of ESG or sustainability. The US perhaps being an outlier, at least for now. What are the major differences? Or it's obviously, especially in the EU, more of a regulatory regime around a lot of this, right?
Yeah. I mean, how much time do we got? There's so many differences geographically here. I think that the simplest and most important difference is in the U.S., we've kind of reverted to talking about this in code, right? And you've seen a lot. If you redline a lot of corporate and investor kind of policies and publications that touch on E and S topics in particular. You're not seeing some of those common phrases like ESG or like sustainability. And you're going back to kind of first principles in many cases. The way that I've always talked about what ESG is, it's all that non-financial stuff that doesn't normally appear in a company's books, but is really important to the company's success, and drives opportunities or risks related to those financial performance levers. That hasn't changed, right? Investors and companies, they still want to make investments in areas that are going to have material payoff and guard against risks that would have material consequence. And so we're still doing it. We're just not talking about it in the same way that we did before. Whereas when I go and see colleagues, it's the sensitivities does not exist, right? There's not a lot of concern about talking about it. There's a more, I think, full-throated trumpeting of, here's what we're doing and here's why it's, good for us, and good for society. I don't think we're going to see that in the U.S. for a while, if ever again. I think that we may just have a new vocabulary that we'll be using in the future that's going to be a little bit different from what you see abroad.
Many other parts of the world, sustainability is getting hardwired into how these businesses operate and create value. It's no longer up for debate. It's increasingly seen as a key driver of growth and obviously engagement of broader societal needs. Let's go back to the topic of board leadership. Richard, as you looked at the results from this year's survey, any major shifts in how board leadership models are set up in different markets? And Mary, I'll get to you about this role of the senior independent director in the UK, the SID role, which I thought was a quite interesting new position.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the SID role is terribly new, but it is one of the most interesting roles, and it's one of the many reasons I thought I was glad to be able to participate with Mary in this conversation. In the U.S., the topic that I don't spend as much time talking about as I once did, but still takes up more time than it should, is whether we should have an independent chair or a lead director. I'm kind of done talking about it, and it's only because really what's more important than the title, in my experience, is what the set of responsibilities is and what the relationship between that person and the CEO is like. That's where the rubber meets the road. I've worked with some very empowered lead directors who had more authority, responsibility, weight than some board chairs, and vice versa. And I think that we're seeing shifts somewhat on the margins. There are camps. I don't think people are going to change their mind about whether they would prefer every CEO as a chair or no CEO as a chair. And I prefer to skip that and help companies figure out, well, what exactly do you want this person to do? And kind of make sure that role meets the criteria that a reasonable observer, that one of your investors would look for to see if the role is really empowered. Obviously different in other markets. The UK, I think, has maybe the most interesting, multi-tier leadership structure. And I'll just, Mary, you live it. How does it work in the UK?
Yeah, as you pointed out, Rich, it's been around nearly 20 years. It was originally envisioned to provide an expansion to the leadership structure in the event shareholders felt like they needed to talk to somebody other than the CEO or the chair, or that they couldn't for some reason. Principally, it is a role that is a sounding board for the chair. And so my chair and I speak frequently. You're also available to the other NEDs on the board if any of them want to have a conversation about anything going on. By statute, one of the key roles is providing a performance review for the chair. So I speak individually with every single person, gather input on the chair's performance. I'm in a fortunate position that we have a wonderful and very effective chair, so that ends up being a very pleasant duty. And given that chairs are non-executive directors with the 9 years of independence, and so there is a forced refreshment in the chair role as well, the SID typically takes the role in the recruitment of a new chair. And so those are the principal responsibilities, but it's fluid. So in the case of my role at Informa, I am also the person on the board that is responsible for colleague engagement. But it doesn't have to be that way. That's just how this board has chosen to construct things. So it's fluid. You're there to help the board run more smoothly, to support the chair in his or her efforts. And as I said, I work with a really gifted and wonderful chair, so it's been a very pleasurable experience.
Now, very insightful, and I imagine it makes sense too, given the many issues that are coming at boards these days, right? You mentioned human capital, ESG, many trends that demand perhaps some changes in how the board is set up, different committees, different charters, the workings of the board will have to adjust to a new operating environment. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit as we close the podcast about your decision to go international.
Sure. So my entire career in the tech industry has been working at global companies. And, when you're a working CEO or exec, you're traveling around the world, you're engaging with customers and partners and other stakeholders in the business. And so day to day, you are naturally in the midst of the differences of business around the globe. And that's fascinating and enjoyable. And you look for best practices, you look for how to share things, how you might approach business differently in different parts of the world. It's really sort of the spice of business and what makes it very, very interesting. You become a full-time board member, and unless you're deliberate about it, you don't have the access necessarily to those global perspectives. I had worked for a European company for a long time, and so as I thought about my board career, I wanted to keep a toehold in Europe and keep that perspective. So I think it is sort of personally rewarding and personally enriching. But at the top of the podcast, Rich talked about the value of migratory patterns. And I've definitely seen that to be the case with the difference in governance and practices that happen in Europe. Compensation, a myriad of factors that are just treated a little bit differently in Europe. It's nice to sort of get an advanced look for some of the trends that are going to be impacting my boards in Europe. Now, it's work. You just as when you work for a global company, you are sometimes getting up early or staying up late. You've got to sort of juggle different personalities, different cultural norms. But again, this is something that I really embraced and enjoyed in my business career. And it's really an honor and a great opportunity to sort of maintain that global perspective.
Great. And it sounds like you were cut out for those roles given your global operating background as well. So you were able to ease into different operational settings, cultural settings quickly. Richard, I'd love to end the podcast with you on that point of migratory patterns as you started the conversation. Any major trends that we see emerge globally that are likely going to hit the U.S. shores in terms of board practice, principles that our members should start to think about?
I was going to start by saying, kind of picking up where Mary just left off, there are many reasons I think that Mary is an exceptional director. But one of the real key values you bring when you sit in multiple places is a just broader perspective, right? And so I think that one trend we will see is continued interest in director candidates and senior executive candidates that have real experience in international markets, particularly markets that are relevant for a company. That's been a kind of a nice to have that I think is becoming more of a focal area for some current search and succession planning activities. And I think it's a good one because you do have well-rounded folks that bring broad perspective. We already talked a little bit about diversity, but I think that's probably the single biggest and most visible trend we'll continue to see. There are a number of European markets where gender diversity is more than 40% for boards, and where racial and ethnic diversity, which is a little bit harder to track, particularly in markets where it is not as immediately obvious as the U.S., what would be considered historically underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. That's going to be a continued trend that will, I think, span the globe, but be an increasing focus in the U.S. and will continue to be targeted by those that have perspectives that, quote unquote, ESG activities are a diversion rather than a business imperative. So I think that'll be another battlefield where that gender diversity and racial and ethnic diversity will be another battlefield for those stock arguments. Beyond that, I think that the primary area to be focused on is the interconnectivity that we're seeing between organizations. I think there's more convergence of kind of governance standards for the 1,000 largest companies globally. I work with a number of companies that are not U.S. enterprises, but are looking to U.S. standards because that's really what they think of their peer group as. And it's been a slower uptake, but still an uptake of U.S. companies being more attentive to what's happening with their peers in terms of industry and size abroad. And so I'd expect more boardrooms will be getting more briefings on what's happening abroad in the next couple of years than have been getting them in the last few.
Yeah, very helpful. You're absolutely right. I mean, industry competition doesn't stop at borders, right? It's boundaryless in some ways. Mary, any final thoughts from you here on trends you see impacting your UK boards or US boards that are global?
I think there's a commonality of trends, as Rich described at the top of the podcast, around dealing with innovation, things like AI, how to manage diversity, ESG, and other non-financial drivers of business success. And these are things that all companies are grappling with. And so as you think about board composition, board experience, the goal is to have the right mix of individuals that can bring the expertise to deal with these very real issues in a way that is relevant for the specific market. So I think there are very common global themes, but the way companies are going to manage through them and hopefully prosper by effectively addressing and leveraging them is going to be highly dependent on the specific composition and expertise of the directors, how they work with management. And that's going to be very specific to the needs of location and the business sector, as well as the maturity of the business that is in question. So a lot of common global themes, but a big opportunity to leverage local requirements to best address them.
Absolutely. Well, thanks both for your deep insights. I think our listeners here in the US and overseas have learned a lot practically, but also conceptually about similarities and differences. And Richard, we'll love to bring you back in at the 10th anniversary next year of the report and see how the world is evolving even more so. But thank you both for your very, very rich perspectives today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit nacdonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship Magazine. That's nacdonline.org. Thank you for listening.